Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you too.
And thanks very much for having accepted my invitation. It's my pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, my pleasure as well.
Right. So, I, I've planned some like 11, 12 questions. So, but before I start talking, before I start asking questions, I have a very brief introductory note about you. For the audience. So Adam Kotsko is an American theologian, religious scholar, cultural critic, and translator, working in the field of political theology. He served as an assistant professor of humanities at Schimmer College in Chicago, which was absorbed into North Central College in 2017. Adam is chiefly known for his interpretive work on philosophers Slavoj Žižek and George Agamben, as well as his writing on American pop culture. So he has authored some books. Amongst them are Žižek and Theology, 2008, Politics of Redemption, The Social Logic of Salvation, 2010, Awkwardness, 2010, Agamben's Coming Philosophy, co-authored with Colby Dickinson, 2015, The Prince of This World, 2016, and Neoliberalism's Demons on the Political Theology of Late Capital, 2018. He has also translated 5 books, I suppose. Amongst them are The Experiment of Language, An Archaeology of the Oath, 2011, The Highest Poverty, 2013, and The Kingdom and the Garden, 2012. So where are you teaching, Adam, now? I mean, are you teaching now?
Yes, I'm teaching at North Central College, although I'm teaching in my apartment because I'm doing online classes.
All right. Okay. So this semester is also to be held online, right?
Some classes are happening in person, but I chose to do online instead.
Oh, you chose it. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And may I ask, what are you teaching?
Right now I'm teaching a course on art and fiction,
Right.
where we are comparing mainly painting with narrative fiction as modes of storytelling. And I'm going to be teaching a brief course later in the semester about the idea of post-scarcity, like the idea that of a society where everybody's needs could be met unconditionally, and whether that's possible, and what are the constraints on that type of thing.
Okay, great. Interesting. So I might start with the first question, if you don't mind. So the first question, let's start with neoliberalism before moving to political theology. So neoliberalism is primarily considered an economical logic which promotes ideas of free trade and reduces the role of government to facilitator of deregulation and privatization. But after likes of Karl Polanyi, we have learned that the market society is not a naturally occurring phenomena, but is a political and social construct. Or accompanying economics has always been a particular worldview or ideology, according to you. How do you define neoliberalism, especially in the book Neoliberalism's Demons, Adam?
I define neoliberalism as a political and economic agenda that aims to reshape as much of social life as possible to be like market competition. It wants every area of our life to be like market competition and to be based on individual free choice. Mm-hmm. And I emphasize that it's not about favoring the market over the state, because the state has to constantly be actively creating these conditions, as you mentioned, through deregulation and privatization. But there's also, subsidies to markets, the government's role in propping up stock markets and central banking and that type of thing. The government is super active under neoliberalism, trying to create the illusion that everything is purely run through markets.
Right. The book actually deals basically with political theology. Political theology is normally conceived as finding similar, like the perhaps the grassroots understanding of political theology is finding similarities between theological and or religious structures and political structures. But you seem to have chosen another path, a path that is rooted in the likes of Carl Schmitt's conception of political theology, but it's not fully. But I don't think it is like fully faithful to even to Carl Schmitt's conception. What do you mean by political theology in an age where not only according to Nietzsche, but also to theologian like Bonhoeffer, God is dead? I mean, how can we define, or how do you define actually political theology?
Yeah, like you say, the discipline started with the observation that there are a lot of parallels between theological and political systems. You know, like the ruler is often presented as similar to God in its power, things like this. And I want to take a step back and ask, why do these similarities occur? And I think it's because both theological systems and political systems are dealing with the same types of problems. A political system needs to not just assert its power, but it needs to convince people that it deserves to be in power, that it's a good system, that the people who are in charge are legitimate. And the same goes with theological systems. Very few people would sign up for a religion where it simply said, God is big and powerful and you better just shut up and follow him. Like, most of the time they want to say that God is good, that God has our best interests in heart, God is seeking justice for us. And I think that it's the desire to justify the current state of affairs, the desire to show that it's legitimate, that's at the root of political theology. And that's why I think we can view neoliberalism as a form of political theology too, because even though it doesn't have any explicit reference to God or something like that, it still wants to present itself as legitimate and just, and ultimately as reflecting what we want collectively as displayed through our individual choices.
Right. Adam, you wrote this book after The Prince of This World, I suppose. I mean, it was published a couple of years afterwards. I mean, there is another concept that might help the readers understand the theme of this book, that is demonization, or an operative definition of demonization that you have already introduced in that Prince of the World, The Prince of This World. To quote you, to demonize is to set someone up to fall, providing one with just the barest silver of agency necessary to render that person blameworthy. Is demonization, or actually what is, or where does it come from, this demonization? And is it the core of the political theology that you introduce in the book?
Yeah, so I'm drawing on the Christian tradition, specifically where they try to answer the question of, you know, basically, where did Satan come from? Where did the devil come from? If God created everything to be good, how can there be this evil being that is setting out to undermine his plans? Unlike the Quran, the Bible does not provide the answer for it. So theologians were left to speculate on their own. And over the course of history, they gradually arrived at the position that God created all the angels and then made this kind of demand that all of them should submit immediately to him. And a certain number of angels did not immediately submit, and they were eternally cast out as demons. And this situation does not seem to me to be, to have what we associate with a moral choice. These angels have only existed for like one instant. They have no context. They don't know who God is. They don't know what the situation is. Can't we talk this out, basically? And so I think, and certain theologians even kind of admit that God set up this artificial situation so that the demons would rebel against him, and then he had something to fight against. And I kind of apply that logic to neoliberalism, where the individual always has a choice, but it seems like the individual can only ever mess up. You know, they can only ever do the wrong thing. And therefore the powers that be get to blame individuals for bad outcomes. For instance, in an American grocery store, typically you go to buy toilet paper, and there's recycled, environmentally friendly toilet paper, and then there's like the environmentally unfriendly paper. And often the recycled paper is both more expensive and more uncomfortable to use than the environmentally unfriendly paper. And so people tend to choose that, and then that shows, oh, people don't want to help the environment. It's not our fault. We're just following what people want. They don't care about the environment.
So I mean, so would you? I mean, just because you made this comparison between Christianity and Islam, do you think that there might be a different process of demonization in Islam? I mean, could you like tell, like hypothetically, could you claim that this demonization is actually comes from Bible? You're not talking about Christianity. You just mentioned Bible, and
I think.
Hello, do you hear me? Hi.
Yes. Hi. Sorry, it looks like our connection was a little disrupted, but probably a demon doing it, I assume. Yeah, I find I've done a lot of study of the Quran, and I've taught courses on the Quran and selections from the Quran in a lot of different settings, and I find the fact that the Quran shows the story of the origin of the devil, or Iblis, to be fascinating. And it's rare in the Quran. I find that most of the stories are very clear and very unambiguous. You know exactly what you're supposed to take away from it. This one, though, it's so strange because God demands that the angels bow down to a created being, which in any other circumstance would be a violation of God's command. That's the worst thing you can do in Islam, right? Is to bow down to an idol or something like that. And so it seems as though Iblis has been trapped. Like he can either obey the commandment not to bow down to anything but Allah, or he obeys Allah's command in that moment, and he chooses, of course, not to bow down to Adam. And he even says, God, you have put me in the wrong.
Right. Yeah.
But at the same time, it seems like he's cool with it. I don't know. Like it seems he tells God, I would like to have a respite so that I can tempt humanity and see how many people I can win away from you. And God says, okay, do it. It seems like there's just much less insecurity about this story than there is in Christianity. It's that Islam sets up the created world as a test, and to have a test, you need to have two options. And so God sets up a situation where the two options exist, and it's very straightforward. And but I do love the Sufi traditions that say that Iblis is actually God's most favored servant. Yeah. That's very fascinating to me.
But not all of them, but some of them actually believe so.
Yeah.
Like that Satan and Muhammad.
Yeah, it's a minority position.
Right. Yeah. Right.
So, yeah, I think that if Islam had prevailed over Christianity as the major world religion, or if Muslims had discovered America or something, maybe things would be different. But I can't predict how they would be different.
Right. Adam, you just, I mean, as the description of the book has it, I quote, neoliberalism's appeal to its promise of freedom in the form of unfettered free choice. But that freedom is a trap. We have just enough freedom to be accountable for our failings, but not enough to create a genuine change. If we choose rightly, we ratify our own exploitation. And if we choose wrongly, we are consigned to the outer darkness and then demonized as a cause of social ills. What is the role of freedom, especially because you mentioned our personal choices in the whole process of operation in neoliberalism, Adam?
I think it's remarkable how similar the role of freedom in Christian theology and in neoliberalism is. Because in Christian theology, at least in the Western tradition, your freedom is only good if you don't use it, basically. Your freedom is only good if you give it up, if you submit to God's will. If you use freedom independently or creatively or unexpectedly, it's always sinful. And I think the same thing happens under neoliberalism. If you completely obey the demands of the system, if you always act in the most economically rational way, if you always, follow all the best practices, then you're viewed as the ideal subject, but you've never actually used your freedom. You've only ever done what other people tell you to do. It's when you do something that's more willful, that's more unexpected or surprising or out of the norm, that's when you're demonized. So I think it's a very exact parallel.
Already in the beginning of the book, you argue that this is a more elaborate project than the priests of this world. And here, I quote you, "This book represents an effort to provide a more detailed warrant of my account of the devil's legacy through a concentrated study of one particular paradigm of modern secular governance, namely neoliberalism, which I put forward as a paradigm in which the strategy of moral entrapment that I call demonization has been pushed to its uttermost limits." I quote you again that you say, "In my study of the theological sources, it seemed to me that God passive aggressively creates demons by putting them in a situation where he knows they will rebel against them, then blaming them for it." And you relate it to the element of choice. I suppose you partly explained that in the previous question, but it's still a bit unclear to me. I mean, would you please elaborate about this relation, this choice thing? I mean, do you think this choice thing is inherent in neoliberalism, especially because you talk about 3 different forms of neoliberalism that I will ask later on?
Yeah, I do think that what unites every form of neoliberalism is the focus on choice, and it's like the Christian theological version of choice in that you either conform and therefore you're not really using your freedom, or you choose wrongly and you deserve whatever bad outcome you get. In the beginning of The Prince of This World, I talk about the famous case of the police shooting in Ferguson, where the police officer testified to the court that he thought that his victim, Michael Brown, looked like a demon. And frequently in American journalism and in opinion pieces, people will try to make excuses for the police officer and emphasize that the victim had a choice, that they could have acted differently, and presumably if they had acted differently, then they would not have been killed. You're probably familiar with the George Floyd protests. I saw an opinion piece by a conservative Christian who said that if George Floyd had stopped resisting the chokehold, that he would have survived and he wouldn't have been killed. It's physically impossible to stop resisting a chokehold. Your body will not let you stop fighting back. And of course, there's also the famous case of Breonna Taylor, who was literally asleep in her bed doing nothing when she was killed. But it seems like the view that the victims somehow earned their death through their bad choice, it seems that is irresistible for a lot of American commentators. Now, often these issues of race are not connected to neoliberalism in a lot of people's minds, because they view neoliberalism as strictly economic and race is this other issue. But in the book, I try to show that they go together. And in fact, the mass incarceration in the US is a very neoliberal policy, because it tries to blame individual Black people for the systemic racism that the prison system produces.
Right.
And
All right. Mm-hmm. And then, like, I mean, I actually a large part of the work is held on this this division, this different, like, you have at least 3 accounts of neoliberalism in the book, which seem to be borrowed from William Davis, if I'm not wrong. Already in the beginning of the book, you argue that they, I mean, first of all, how do you differentiate these 3 forms of neoliberalism?
it's basically the 3 phases are a way of dividing up the history of neoliberalism. The first phase, I believe he calls it combative neoliberalism.
Right.
This is the stage when Reagan and Thatcher, most famously, are establishing neoliberalism.
Right.
And this is a stage that's just a flurry of activity. They're trying to change everything they can. They're actively working to reshape society.
Mm-hmm.
And then a second phase begins in the 90s called normative neoliberalism. And this is when the neoliberal revolution has basically been achieved.
Mm-hmm.
It's the new normal. And usually, and the Democrats and the Labor Party take over the governance of neoliberalism in the Anglophone world. And it just is a way, like, there's not as much activity. There's not as much political activism and kind of energy devoted to it. It's more of a matter of fine-tuning the system and trying to make sure that the outcomes seem fair. The final phase that Davies lays out is punitive neoliberalism. And this happens after, especially after the global financial crisis. And essentially, at this point, neoliberalism stops promising economic growth. It stops promising rewards to individual. It just basically is meting out the punishment to everybody.
Right.
It just we bought too many houses. We made bad choices, whatever, and basically the system exists to make us suffer the consequences of our actions.
Right.
And that leads then to the right-wing reaction that that wants to make sure that the right people are suffering, basically the non-white, non-Christian, non-normative people.
And Adam, do you go that far to say that neoliberalism under Obama and under Trump has changed its phases like that much? I mean,
I think it has, although the change is not as great as people think. For the first 2 years of the Trump administration, for instance, they couldn't pass a new federal budget, and they basically just continued the same budget that had been agreed between Obama and the Republicans in the later years of the Obama administration. So even given the huge personality difference between Trump and Obama, the fact that Trump personally hates Obama, all of this, the underlying public policy regime remained very, very similar. It was more a difference of priorities. And it seems that the areas where Trump has been successful in making changes have been areas where he's making people suffer, essentially. The only thing he's been able to achieve is making more people suffer.
Right.
Everything else kind of remains the same as it was under Obama.
I mean, there is this kind of, like, in the book, you implicitly criticize, although at the same time, like, appreciate and celebrate the progressive politics of Sanders and Corbyn. In a way, you implicitly criticize the reactionary, perhaps, I mean, I call it reactionary politics, as if they are forcing, as if they are driving people back to this kind of Fordism. Is it true? Like, I mean, is it your criticism of Sanders? Is it still applicable?
Yeah, I think that both Sanders and Corbyn, their greatest strength is their greatest weakness. They're politicians who have been around for a long time. They're both relatively elderly at this point. They both remember that a time before neoliberalism. They both know that it's not the only solution, and they know that what came before was better in most ways. And so this creates the strange situation where the people reacting against neoliberalism are extremely elderly politicians that are energizing like the very youngest cohorts in society. But I think that there is a backward-looking aspect to both Corbyn and Sanders. They both want to restore what we had before, and I agree that it was better. That neoliberalism has been hugely destructive, but the things that we were able to build up before, historical circumstances were very different then. It's, there's a lot has changed. The fall of the Soviet Union, the kind of decline in productivity, the fact that the civil rights movement has kind of undermined the attempt to get white racists to buy into the welfare state by discriminating against Black people. That's obviously not something I want to bring back, but it is a political obstacle. And I think that simply saying we used to have this and we can have it again, that's not sufficient. That's not really grappling with how much society has been transformed and how much state capacities have been transformed.
Adam, I suppose in page 95 of the book, you highlight the logic of enchantment, quoting you, from a political theological perspective, we can see that this infernal system is far from being some merely particular issue or cause. It is the most extreme expression of the logic of our neoliberal order. End of quote. You talk later of the psychic life attributed to or fitting this state of affairs, like anxiety and shame that Mark Fisher highlights, or similar to the process of responsibilization that fritter away our life with worry and paperwork and its application, which I suppose you take from Vonnie Brown. Can you elaborate on the psychic life attributable to neoliberalism?
The thing that is so difficult to deal with in neoliberalism is that there is a new test every day. You never arrive. You never finish. You're constantly put to a fresh test. You constantly have to prove yourself again and again and again. The market competition never stops, and this creates a situation where is the sound okay? Can you hear some? Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry. This creates a situation where you're bound to fail eventually. Like if you're gambling, no matter how long you keep winning, you're bound to lose eventually, right? If you're forced to keep going back to the table over and over and over, you're bound to lose eventually. And I think that this creates a sense of anxiety and, in some cases, despair among people, because on the one hand, nothing they have is ever secure. It can always be taken away. And if it's taken away, they will be blamed for it.
Right.
Because they didn't do a good enough job. They didn't maximize their resources. They didn't do what they should have done. And even though, even people like myself who realize that it's a systemic problem, that a lot of things are outside of the individual's control, a lot of things are simply arbitrary, I still can't help but feel a certain amount of shame and anxiety about the opportunities that I was not able to get, or the things that I missed out on, as though it's my fault, even though I know it's not personally my fault. You know how it is. Knowing something does not change your emotional reaction.
Right.
So I think it's really interesting that the younger generation of people, the people in college now or recent graduates, basically people under 30 in the US, are rejecting this system, even though it's the only system they've ever known. Wendy Brown is worried that if a generation is born under neoliberalism, they'll like forget that human freedom exists, or they'll forget that there was ever anything different. But this very same generation that she was worried was going to turn into a bunch of drones is rejecting the system because it's made them miserable. It's made them miserable. Every year, the number of college students with some type of psychiatric disorder seems to increase, and that's because they've been constantly competing with each other since they've been in kindergarten, practically, for no reason. You know, it's simply because the neoliberal order thinks that it'll be better if we're always competing, if we're always trying to prove ourselves. Even though it produces massive waste, it produces massive anxiety in the individuals. And I think that this is the fact that neoliberalism makes people so miserable is the one greatest hope.
Right. I will be back to this question, I mean, later on. But now, I mean, I didn't actually plan it to talk about Iran, but I have one question in relation between Iran and the US, which is the case of Iran and its gesture towards, I mean, at least a post-revolutionary Iran and its gesture towards fighting international imperialism on the one hand, and the US, especially under Trump, which demonizes Iran and has resulted in actually unending or like day-to-day brutal sanctions against Iranian. Is there any way in your work that can shed light on such external demonizations? I mean, like demonization in kind of international affairs. Like, could we go that far to say that the US is actually blaming Iran?
Yes, I think the agreement that Obama negotiated with Iran was one pause in the demonization. And I think that there are a lot of ways that this entrapment works internationally, not just individually. So, for instance, Trump left the nuclear accord, and then he justified further sanctions by the fact that Iran stopped abiding by it. That's stupid. Like, the agreement is no longer valid. But the fact that Iran violated it after he left is somehow proof that you never would have kept it, right? That it's impossible. And sanctions too. I think it's been shown that the effect of sanctions is always to increase the perceived legitimacy of the regime, because it's obvious that the US is to blame for these economic problems, even though there are probably some economic problems that are just independently caused by public policy in Iran or government policy. You have the US conveniently to blame. And so I think Iran is kind of an extreme case due to the extreme demonism that has happened for a generation, basically, ever since the hostage crisis. But similar dynamics happen, I think, in more apparently benevolent situations, like the fact that nations typically return to the IMF or return to the World Bank for new loans again and again and again. And as a condition of getting the new loans, the IMF or World Bank imposes public policy that will worsen the conditions of most people and probably require them to go back. They're freely agreeing to do these things.
Freely again, right.
Yeah, freely. They're basically extorted into doing it, but because it's formally a free contract, it's their own fault that the economy doesn't. And of course, they never fully implement the desired policies, which means, oh, you didn't do what you said. Like, So I think, yeah, that's one aspect that I wish I had done more with in the book, but it just was not on my radar as much. I think I was a little too focused on the U.S. Situation in specific.
Right. I have a couple of more questions. I try to convince myself not to ask any non-academic or non-intellectual question.
Oh, well.
Well, I mean, I might overwrite the spheres of the book. I want to stick to the book and the questions that come out of the book. But although you don't submit to, I mean, in the book, although you don't submit to this Marxist or I mean, neither Marxist nor Foucauldian paradigm, it's only in the end of the book that you highlight the possibilities of ending the world, quoting Bonhoeffer and his theology without God, and probably other writers like Dorothea Zoll, I would say. What are the principles of this world to come? What are the signs of these people to come, the belief to come? I mean, like there is an interesting part in. I just even brought this book here. In the beginning of the Mystic and Widerstand by Dorothea Zoll, there is this very interesting. In the very introduction, actually, there is this interesting note from Friedrich von Hegel, the 19th century theologian. That, I mean, von Hegel makes a difference between actually institutional, das Intellektuelle, and their intellectual, and das Mystische, and the mystic. Actually, the three ways of dealing with the world. Yeah. And so what I would like to ask you, I mean, actually, the book deals a lot with the institutional and the intellectuals. I mean, the way institutions and intellectuals deal with the world in order to make it better or worse, actually. Is there any mystic part? I mean, according to Zoll, I would say. I mean, mystic, by mystic, I don't mean actually the mysticism as it is understood in the New Age, actually, world religions, actually. Yeah? Is there anything mystic that you want to add actually to the book? Or
yes, it's very strange.
I mean, especially sorry, Adam, especially because we talked about this psychic life in neoliberalism. We talk about what the likes of Mark Fisher and Wendy Brown. I mean, this anxiety, this day-to-day stress. Yeah. Is there anything mystic that can help us?
Yeah, I think it's interesting because neoliberalism does have some like mystic practices, like mindfulness, or
definitely,
yeah, like Buddhist style meditation or something like that. And those seem to be basically coping mechanisms to me. They just seem to be ways to help you tolerate the constant stress. I'm not sure what if any religious or meditative practices would help point towards this world, but I think we would know that the better world is happening if, for instance, we experience, instead of anxiety, we experience security and belonging and joy. Those are emotions that are very, very difficult to find under neoliberalism. And I emphasize in the book the need for some type of collective agency, some type of solidarity among people, that we need to, stop this cycle of blaming people. And I think that, I mentioned that I was teaching this course about post-scarcity. I think that a society where people's basic needs are met unconditionally, whether they've earned it or not, I think we can do that and we should do that. And that would be much better, that people don't need to worry that they are going to die if they're not useful to somebody else. But I think in my own experience, I'm religious person. But my experience at the school that I have been teaching at, Shimer College, which it's continued in a different form now, but we emphasize like we emphasized democratic governance of the school itself. It was a very small school, but every single person in the school, whether they were a janitor, a student, a professor, the president of the college, we had a democratic assembly where everybody got one vote equally and tried to solve our most important problems in that form. And our classes are run in the same way, that we all sit at a table in a circle, and we're not focused on me, the professor, and my authority. We're focused on the text that we've all read together and how we can help each other understand it. And I think that my experience of working in that kind of collaborative environment, that has given me a sense of satisfaction and belonging that might be akin to those type of religious feelings, that there's something more going on in this. You know, obviously not every class is very interesting. Obviously a big meeting with 100 people can be tedious, but there is something else going on that makes it seem worthwhile, that makes it seem like I'm participating in something bigger than myself. And I'm sure a lot of people have experiences like that in a lot of different settings. It's not mysterious. It's not unknown to us what it would mean to live in a more democratic and collaborative world.
Right.
We just need to find those places where it happens and say, like, how can we scale this up? How can we make this bigger?
Right. Right. So my last question is about the U.S. and the upcoming elections. How would you define? How would you speculate the actual situation and the possibilities ahead of the U.S. in the upcoming election?
Obviously, a second term for Trump would be an extremely bad outcome for the U.S. and the world. So I hope that Biden wins. I also hope that the election proceeds normally without the need for the intervention of the Army or something like that. But what the Biden campaign is promising is just laughably inadequate to the problems that the US and the world are facing. I don't think that there's any eventuality where Biden winning would be worse than Trump winning. But it does seem like in either case, like if Biden fails to deliver good outcomes for people, if he fails to make their lives better in a demonstrable way, that can set up an even worse reaction. And simply returning to the status quo of the Obama years is not a very ambitious goal. And I worry that he doesn't even want to do that. So yeah, the options within the existing constitutional and party system in the US are extremely unappealing. And even though every rational person has to hope that Biden wins, I deeply resent that this is the choice that we are making.
Are you writing a book like recently? Are you translating something now or writing something now?
This summer I finished work on a book. It's an essay collection called What is Theology? And it talks about theology in connection with philosophy and political theology, and has essays on a range of different topics. I have one on Bonhoeffer. I'm sure you'll enjoy that.
All right.
And yeah, that's under review right now. So hopefully that'll come out sometime next year.
Great. Have you ever been to Europe, Adam?
To Europe?
To Europe, to Berlin, to Germany.
Yeah, I've been to several European countries.
Okay, so actually I hope to see you in Europe. I mean, if you happen to come to Berlin, or who knows, if you happen to come to Iran, I hope to see you there, and we will have a talk there again. Yeah,
that would be great. I have visited Pakistan, so
Oh,
maybe if the opportunity to come to Iran
yeah,
arises,
definitely.
I could do that. Yeah.
Yeah, it would be
Although
great.
Europe would be easier. Yeah.
Right. So I really have to thank you, Adam, for not only for the time, but also for the generosity that you sent me the book and the effort you made to my questions. I hope they were consistent enough. Some
Yeah.
questions I try to be as like basic as and consistent as possible for the Iranian audience. And I also thank you on behalf of the audience. I hope I will have this video subtitled sometime soon and send it to some friends in Iran. And so I suppose you're going to start your day. It's like 12 o'clock. It's 11 o'clock there?
Yep. Yep.
Right. Okay.
All right. Yeah. Well, thanks a lot. This has been fun.
Yeah, my pleasure, Adam.
Okay.
Have a great day.
You too.
Bye.